close and get close, personal, and dirty with the experience of poverty, to actually confront it in its reality, and often to live around it as much as you can. Okay? The other key element of this is that the reason why these people were getting involved in this type of work was because they wanted to produce sympathy amongst their readers for the plight of the poor. Okay? So they had to find techniques for connecting the suffering of the poor to their readers, to try and make them connect so that their readers would be moved to do something about it. Almost all of these investigative exposures of poverty led to the creation of a charitable fund by that newspaper. And this is the last point I want to make on this slide, which is that it's not just a new style of investigating poverty, it's also closely tied to a new type of journalism that emerges in the 1870s and the 1880s. Journalism up until that point had been basically about reporting events, okay, and had been often about simply a catalogue of what meetings had been going on, who'd been doing what. Okay. From the 1870s, you get a series of new editors who want to make journalism about making news, not simply reporting it. Okay? They want to create campaigns that will shape the news agenda rather than simply passively report what the politicians and the businessmen and all the rest are actually up to. Before we move on, when you were reading Mearns's Bitter Cry of Outcast London, okay, how was it that he was trying to portray the plight of the poor? How was he trying to connect his readers to the grim reality of poverty? Who was he generally trying to portray as the victims of poverty? That would be a good place to start. Yeah. Right, children. You know, the most innocent of all victims. No one can possibly blame a child for the condition of poverty in their which, the accident of birth has put them in the situation. So children are all over this type of literature. Who else? Yeah, Nicole. Women.
You talk about how you will have a children shirts and pants and they only,
Right. Again, women absolutely key, okay? Because remember, in this world, okay, it's the male breadwinner who is the primary failure for not having supported his family. So women and children are much easier to portray as victims of a set of circumstances beyond their control. Anyone else? Women, children, yes. What's your name? Christine. And old people, thank you. Christine's on fire today. Old people, again, old people, very, very important. You know, they may have had a hard-working life and they're left with nothing and nowhere to go in their old age. So the other thing that he does then is give you carefully written accounts of the suffering of particular individuals. He's not writing about whether these women, they're these children, they're these old people. What he does is try and give you individual examples so that you can actually feel what it's like to be a kid run over and have your arm broken and have no one to help. Okay? This is about the individuation of suffering so that you as a reader can identify with that single individual who is suffering from this big unknowable thing called poverty. Now, that type of work, as I said, was primarily organized around the launch of charitable campaigns. Okay? The quantitative method, okay, that develops at around the same time uses a completely different set of techniques. This is not about getting as close to a personal encounter with poverty. This is about maintaining a good scientific distance from the experience of the poor. Okay? And the reason is basically because of the ability to statistically measure the degree of poverty. Okay? So effectively what this quantitative method does is count how many people are poor. And it tries to quantify not just the numbers of people that are poor, but what being poor actually is. Okay, so in the qualitative tradition, you know poverty through these individual stories of suffering. Okay, and it's about how much you sympathize with them. In the quantitative method, they're going to develop a precise definition of poverty. Poverty is going to be when you don't earn this much. Okay, and it's not a question of whether you sympathize or not. It's not a question of whether you can identify with a specific individual or not. It's about an abstract but absolute definition of what poverty was. And so in order to do that, what they had was to develop a system where you could quantify poverty. And effectively it went a little like this. Okay, you would hire someone to go into the homes of every person, okay, every family, and count how many people lived in that family, ask them how much money they all lived on, ask them how much they paid in rent, how much they paid in food, and then go back, report the details of each individual household, and then that would be punched into, well, not punched in because this was all done by hand, it would be calibrated into an aggregate study of all of those individual households. Okay? Now the two, and the absolutely important, critically important thing here was that you had to have effectively what we would now call a questionnaire, but they didn't call it a questionnaire at the time. You used to have a questionnaire on an account book that was exactly the same for every single household. Okay, so that your unit of measurement, the way in which you measured poverty, was the same across all of these households and across every locality that you studied it in. Okay, so that you could come up with a nationally aggregate figure. Now the two key figures here are Charles Booth, okay, Life, Labour of the People of London, this massive 17-volume project that took over a decade and produced these amazing maps, and Seabound Rowntree, who did a study of York in 1901, of poverty in York. Now, both of these are studies of particular places, London and York, but the idea was that these cities could provide a cross-section and that they were therefore representative in some way of society as a whole. Okay? And clearly that idea of a case study or of a cross-section continues to be vital to what it is that we do in the social sciences, of how it is that we create manageable sort of research projects. So Booth does this wonderful thing of producing maps of poverty. They've done all the statistical work, okay, so then they can map very precisely what the conditions are in every single street. Okay, so as you can see from the scale at the top, the yellow colour, and there isn't any yellow on this map, but the yellow colour here is the upper, middle, and upper classes, in short, the wealthy, down to, surprise, surprise, black, which is the lowest class, the vicious, and the semi-criminal. Okay. and you can play about with these maps and look at specific areas of and you know, they're very cool. Now, what Booth does is discover that 35% of Londoners lived in poverty. Okay. Now, even though he had these different categories of poverty, from the lowest to the very poor to just the regular poor on 18 to 21 shillings a week. And what you see, therefore, is the beginning of the social categorization of social and economic categories. Yeah, that is so key to market research and to advertising and sociological research to this day. Although you'll notice, I hope, immediately that this isn't simply a thing about social and economic income. It's not a straightforward income measure of your social and economic class. Instead, it has this highly moralized nature to it, so that the lowest class are not just lowest in terms of their income, but of their morals. They're vicious and they're semi-criminal. Okay? And of course, just as Beddoes portrayed, you know, the Celtic people of Britain in his Index of Negrescence that we talked about in the lecture on the Irish famine, so these people are racialized as black. Rowntree does a similar thing, but what Rowntree's big innovation was, this, by the way, is one of these account books that they would go in and measure up, handwritten account books where they do the income and expenditure of every family. Rowntree makes a big innovation, which is to say that he comes up with an absolute definition of what poverty is. Okay? And he makes a distinction between primary and secondary poverty. Anybody know what the basis of that distinction is? The difference between primary and secondary poverty? No? Primary poverty, we don't actually have poverty lines anymore, but they existed for a good part of the 20th century. Primary poverty is when you have absolutely not enough income to be able to support yourself and your family in a healthy, productive life. Okay, you haven't got enough food, basically, to support yourself and your family. Secondary poverty is a slightly more tricky thing, because it's when you potentially got enough income, but you use it in inefficient ways. You use it in ways that pull you down into a condition of poverty. What might those be, do you think? Anthony? Buying booze. Very good. That's a very bad thing. And surprise, 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 the poorer people were, the more alcohol they tended to want to consume to try and forget the conditions in which they were living. So poverty, what else? Yes. Gambling. Yeah, not a whole lot of gambling, but a bit. What else might be in this category? Rebecca. Prostitution. No, I don't think prostitution. I don't think Rowntree could even get his head around the idea that he was a good Quaker man. That was just like, what? Smoking, obviously. Yes, the Rowntree chocolate family, indeed.